one thing I try to remind them, and always myself, frankly, is that life's lived in chapters. And so you want to try to understand, what chapter am I in right now? What am I trying to get out of this chapter? What's expected of me on this chapter? I found when I had little kids, as you might have found as well, Scott, I mean, life was expecting just a lot of chaos from me. And so really trying to have those priorities figured out to the extent possible was pretty important.
Welcome to this week's As Unexpected podcast, when we talk to C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists about how they lead into the future when the future generally goes as unexpected. I'm Scott Marshall, your host, and my own professional experience has made me a believer that it's not how you show up when all goes as planned, but it is how you show up when things go as unplanned. Given all of their experiences, each of our guests has become very attuned to the fact that the future is not to be predicted. My hope is that this podcast can help all of you become better leaders by building the core leadership capabilities for leading in an uncertain world. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of As Unexpected. As usual, I'm your host, Scott Marshall. Today's guest I've known for right around 8 years. We met for the first time on a voyage of a lifetime, and got to be faculty on this voyage of a lifetime. And I've since got to know her and her family really well. But that's not what we're here to talk about. She has this extraordinarily accomplished career. She currently is a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, but has served in 3 different administrations, has published multiple books, is a leader in thinking about global politics, defense. I'm just so excited to hear what she has to say. Mara Karlin, welcome, or should I say Dr. Mara Karlin, welcome to the As Unexpected podcast.
Thank you. It is such a treat to be here with you, Scott.
Awesome. Mara, if you don't mind, could you just give us, your bio is huge, so much, but if you could just give us a sense of how you came about to be in this area of defense and policy, and where you're at now. What's your work today?
Absolutely. I wholly blame semester at sea for how I ended up where I am. I had sort of a perfectly designed future. When I was in high school and college, I would study political science, I would go to law school, etc. And then I heard about this semester at sea program from someone at my university, and I went and did it in fall 99, the voyage of the millennium, and it turned all of my plans upside down. We went to all sorts of places across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and it started to get me really interested, not just in international relations, but in particular in issues of competition and conflict. I remember so well on our voyage, we went to Bosnia. The war had not been over long there. We went to Egypt, which was suffering from all sorts of challenges on the security front. And I just got so curious about kind of defense and security issues, which had never even crossed my mind. I spent another semester after that abroad in the Middle East. And by the time I went back to college, I kind of had everything totally rethought, and ended up coming to Washington, D.C. for what was supposed to be 1 year to think about U.S. policy, and then to go to law school, of course. And the result is 24 years later, I never made it to law school and I never left Washington. So effectively, I started to just really recognize that security issues, while they are not similar around the world, they can rhyme. And the role of the United States is especially outsized in shaping them for better or sometimes for worse. And so I wanted to get involved in that. I ended up doing an internship in the Department of Defense in the Pentagon, and it was just simply fascinating. So I ended up then spending a lot of my career there. I worked for 6 Secretaries of Defense across 3 administrations, Democrats and Republican, on just about any kind of big challenge involving issues of war and peace over the last 2 decades.
That is awesome. Could you to what extent does your own family heritage, because you've talked about some, tie you to this in some important or meaningful way?
Absolutely. So my family's originally from Iran. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I know that because I never met anyone who had been a part of the government, anyone who was a part of the military, until I went to college. But I was always the kid who read Time magazine and Newsweek magazine and wanted to talk with my family to try to understand what was happening far away. It really never crossed my mind or my family's mind that was something one would get involved in. I mean, frankly, with my dad coming from Iran, the government wasn't necessarily seen as a positive thing that you would want to be a part of. And my family's always been really grateful for the opportunities that my dad got when he came here. And so it was intriguing to start to realize, actually, not only is the U.S. role really important on these issues, but you can do something here, right? You can actually try to shape it.
That's awesome. Thank you. Now, going to the heart of the podcast, this is about the as unexpected, and certainly a lot about me and my role here, and how I probably came up with this philosophy around how it's really important to show up when things don't go as you planned. That is the heart and soul of leadership in so many ways. You've had so many opportunities to be in leadership positions. Again, just as Mara said, she's been in multiple administrations. She just brought her expertise across the board. And I'm sure you faced many circumstances that did not go as people around you or you might have expected. We would love to hear some of those stories, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. There are so many. So maybe I'll start with one that perhaps will resonate with folks, because it's all about having a certain dream and then that dream doesn't come to fruition. So my plan when I finished graduate school, the dream was to go work at the Pentagon on Middle East policy. I had spent a lot of time studying Middle East issues, had a real expertise in them. But when I graduated, there weren't any jobs available on that topic. And so the office said, well, we've got a position available to focus on U.S. policy towards Pakistan and India. I didn't really know a whole lot about either of these places and the U.S. relationship with them. I had actually gone to India on my SAIS voyage, so was fascinated by it. But frankly, I thought nothing could be as interesting as the Middle East. So I quite reluctantly said, all right, I guess I will do that. Could not have been more wrong about just how fascinating these issues were. First of all, this is in the years not long after the September 11th attacks. So U.S.-Pakistan relations were really complicated, right? The U.S. is fighting this war in Afghanistan, and the role of Pakistan's military is a little bit unclear. How helpful are they actually being or not? How much can the U.S. rely on them or not? And then in terms of India, when I was on my SAIS voyage, the population of India hit 1 billion people. And I remember us talking about that in fall 1999. And in fact, as I started working on these issues, President Bush met with the Indian Prime Minister and they announced that we were going to have a strategic relationship. So suddenly I kind of had the interesting job of figuring out, what does it mean? How do we actually transform this partnership from one that had been sort of fledgling to actually a strategic one? So that would be one great example where sort of professionally I had a plan and it got turned upside down. I realized in a very healthy and surely obvious way looking back that a whole lot of the world's pretty darn interesting.
Yeah, that's a great example of, we live life forward, but understand it backwards. So you sort of sort out, wow, I was reluctant, but what a powerful learning experience. And how did I live my life after that as a consequence?
Absolutely. I often tell my students that I can give them this beautiful and really clear and coherent narrative about how my career turned out, but they need to know that it's entirely made up. And I had no idea that that's how it would turn out. But as you know, so much of these decisions are every couple of years, you think, do I turn left? Do I turn right? Do I take this or do I do this other thing? And then as long as you're working with good people on important issues and learning a lot, usually works out pretty all right.
That's a great way to frame it. Working with great people on important issues, no doubt. You know my story. I went on that voyage with you in spring of 17. Mm-hmm. I certainly had no plans to leave tenure and full professor for this little institute. no idea at all. And lo and behold, 10 months later, I'm doing it. So that's absolutely right. I think that's just a great example for people when they're thinking in their careers, no matter where they're at in their career.
Absolutely, absolutely, and having that view. One thing that's been a bit complicated with the path I've pursued is I've become a political appointee. That means you serve at the pleasure of the president. So when looking at possible opportunities in my future, it's not just based on, am I qualified? Do I have good connections? It's based on things that are so beyond my control, like what happens in an election. And I think that only sort of furthers this idea of needing to be adaptable and needing to be resilient, all skills, frankly, that SAIS very much injected in me.
Yeah. So can you talk about what led you to write the books that you have? Because, one, I think, came out in like 2021, so not that long ago, 4 years ago. What sort of developed that drive, that interest, and, I'm going to get this out into the public?
Absolutely. So for both of my books, they kind of came out of things that I had worked on, and I wanted to figure out, did this make sense? How do we better understand it? The U.S. military, frankly, a lot of militaries have this tradition known as after action reviews, which I think forces a really kind of humble approach where whenever something happens, you step back and you say, all right, so how'd that go? What worked or what didn't work? And so my first book was looking at building militaries in fragile states. Effectively, I had worked for the Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, across the Bush and Obama administrations. And Secretary Gates said, look, of how we deal with conflict is by training, equipping, organizing other militaries to deal with problems. And I had lived a lot of this when I had worked on Pakistan, for example. Later on, I had worked on Lebanon and Jordan, defense relations with the U.S., for example. And this seemed to make sense. I was sitting next to colleagues working with the Iraqi and Afghan militaries. So I wanted to figure out, all right, so how's this going? When have we done it better? So I tried to look from kind of post-World War II onward. When were we more likely to succeed? The second book, The Inheritance, America's Military After 2 Decades of War, really came out of living in the Pentagon throughout the post 9/11 wars. And these are the longest wars in contemporary U.S. history. And it seemed to me that the legacies of them had to be pretty big for the military. And I wanted to understand what they were. I really didn't want to write the book, to be honest. Writing a book is kind of a miserable and difficult experience, especially if you worry about like getting the story right, which especially for this topic, like it needed to be spot on. But it felt like it had to be out there, right? What did the military inherit from these 2 decades or so of war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan? So I tried to tell this story actually through the words of the senior military leaders. And it was really a kind of a fascinating experience. It took, as good research projects do, twists and turns that I wouldn't have expected, particularly looking at the role of the military vis-a-vis U.S. society, vis-a-vis civilians, and in particular, the role of the military vis-a-vis itself, right? How folks were seeing what they had done, why they had done it, and how they were dealing with what were ultimately pretty ambiguous results in these conflicts.
And as you just suggested, the legacy is longstanding, and even today, of course, the legacy of those wars is very present. And even going back to your original position that you reluctantly accepted, the Pakistan and India relationships, back in the news again. And you probably are someone who's always astute on what's happening there. And so when the public in America suddenly sees something in the media, it probably doesn't surprise you that this stuff comes up. So you have that insight, which is amazing. So you've completed these books, and now you're back at Johns Hopkins. You're teaching your students. And how would you approach it with your students in terms of preparing them for dealing with the unexpected, not just career-wise, like what should I do in my next job or whatever, but in just work life when, new projects come along or projects fail or, the environment shifts dramatically. How do you talk to your students about that?
Absolutely. So this past year, I've taught a couple classes. One's been on like the history and the future of war. I've also taught on leadership ethics and decision making. And
It's a big one.
it's a huge one. It has been so fascinating and so fun. That's a class I hadn't taught before, and it's just easily one of my favorites. So I think a couple skills are pretty useful, really working on those communication skills. So being able orally and in written form to convey a whole lot of information in a pretty brief amount of time, being exceedingly well read, being able to argue all sides. I have a tactic that sometimes probably drives some students nuts, but they will make a confident argument in class and I will say, great, now argue the opposite. Effectively, what I want them to do is be able to sit in different chairs and understand the pros and cons, especially because I find in my field, and I suspect you may find this as well, you're often choosing among like not very good, pretty bad, and awful options. You don't usually get a whole lot of like butterflies or unicorns options. And so right, being able to really interrogate that can be so very important. And then as students, and then of course, being able to like synthesize a whole lot of information and figure out those themes and patterns. As students, I think, try to get ready for these unexpected moments. One thing I try to remind them, and always myself, frankly, is that life's lived in chapters. And so you want to try to understand, what chapter am I in right now? What am I trying to get out of this chapter? What's expected of me on this chapter? I found when I had little kids, as you might have found as well, Scott, I mean, life was expecting just a lot of chaos from me. And so really trying to have those priorities figured out to the extent possible was pretty important.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program for college students and adults on career breaks, sabbaticals, or retired, interested in learning and exploring the world together. Learn more about the Lifelong Learner program at www.semesteratSea.org. Yeah. So there's a lot of directions we could go with what you just said, because there's so much packed in there. One thing that comes up for me for sure is, understanding multiple perspectives on any particular issue, and understanding that, in fact, life is lived mostly in the gray and with uncertainty, when our human brains and our hearts want certainty and predictability.
So bad.
And it's obviously something we talk about to have them intellectualize, but then to actually embed it in their being is a whole nother element, right? How do we just present ourselves as, I have strong core values and I make decisions in a rigorous process and I live in the gray?
It's so hard, right? And that's probably the first thing to acknowledge. Like, human beings, our brains kind of aren't designed for this. So recognize you're pushing against it. It's not going to be simple. Some of it's figuring out what is it that you want to achieve at what time and in what ways. Some of it's having some really solid folks around you. I think of this as sort of like your own board of directors, and it can be partners or family or friends, the folks who are going to say, hey, is that who you are? Is that what you really want? And I don't know if you found this, but I often find, like, when I go to folks on my like board of directors, with kind of like an existential life question, I'll feel tremendously angsty about it. And they like immediately cut through and can tell exactly where things are going. So I think that's probably part of it. And then forcing yourself to get out of your comfort zone. Frankly, it's one of the things I think Semester at Sea does so masterfully, whether it's for those of us who are recidivists who've done it a couple times, or even folks who are doing it just once. It sort of instills in you this idea of, if things are a little too easy and I'm feeling a little too comfortable, I need a shock to my system. And how do I create that shock?
Yeah, boy, I do understand that. We like to talk about safe, but often uncomfortable. That zone of growth.
Mm-hmm.
Safe, you can't feel unsafe. If you feel unsafe, right, we all cocoon ourselves to stay safe. But we also can't be in total chaos.
Mm-hmm.
There's very little learning or growth that goes on in total chaos. So it's that zone of discomfort. And that can be exhausting. So we don't want to spend too much time in it, but we want to move in and out of it. And that is the model of our program, for sure, Semester at Sea, is moving in and out of discomfort so that's where our growth can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. So this, I think, is a good segue. For listeners, I oftentimes like to read a quote. And for Mara, I've chosen this book called In Praise of Doubt, just to the topics we've been talking about. It's written by Peter Berger and Anton Zitterveld. I can't say his name very well. Do you know how to say that name? Zitterveld? Zitterveld. I'm going to go with Zitterveld.
You're doing as well as one can.
But this quote just seemed to be very fitting for what Mara's done in her career. And I think she could really lend some really thoughtful response to this. So here's the quote. The politics of moderation depends on a balance between a core certainty and many possibilities of action, none of which has the quality of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And that core certainty has to do with the freedom and the rights of the individual.
That's great. Yeah.
There's a lot in this book. It's hard to find the perfect quotes because it's a little overly dense, but I do like that particular quote.
Absolutely. It's so easy when we're in a moment to feel like we know exactly what the thing is and exactly how it's going to play out. And what I find really useful is to stress test that. So one of my very favorite books is called Thinking in Time. It's by Richard Neustadt and Ernest May. It came out a couple decades ago. And effectively, the idea is you as a human being are going to use history to help you understand how to deal with today and the future. So do it smartly, right? If you're going to use analogies, all these kinds of things, just do it smartly. But they give you a couple tips and tricks that I think are especially relevant to that quote. So for example, they say, when you're working on an issue, make a bet on what's going to happen, right? So if, I'll give you a great example of something I called wrong in my career. Late 2021 to early 2022, I was working in the Pentagon. We started to get all this information that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, this massive conventional attack. And at that moment, I and many other folks thought, gosh, Russia has spent so much time modernizing its military over the last decade. Ukraine's going to fall really fast, right? If you had asked probably any of us at that moment in time in February 2022, what's going to happen here? I think the view was they're going to try to fight, and they being Ukraine, they're going to try to fight. They're going to at least lose the capital really, really quickly. And frankly, a lot of countries around the world, especially around Europe, are going to kind of bicker and debate what's really going on, and they're not going to be able to help in a timely manner. Probably would have put that as a bet of 80%. Spectacularly wrong, right? Turns out that Russia's military modernization wasn't that great. Turns out Ukraine's military was able and willing to fight effectively. And in fact, that 50 plus countries, including most of Europe effectively said, we want to give Ukraine a lot of support militarily. And so what I appreciate about that trick is you put the bet down and then you get to see, okay, so where was I right or where was I wrong? Another trick that they offer that I think is in line with what you're saying is when we're using analogies, they say you have to force yourself to think of the likeness and the differences between those two analogies. So for example, along lines of what you're saying, if I feel very certain about this thing, trying to figure out, why do I feel certain? What does that look like? How is this similar to and different from other things I'm comparing it to? Frankly, that often forces you to reanalyze a bit and kind of rethink things.
So, you go to the extreme. Am I as certain about this outcome as I am about the sun coming up tomorrow? No, that's a first test. I'm not that certain. Am I, you can go on. Am I certain that I'll be alive tomorrow? You could go through and just keep stress testing it and then okay, this is how certain I am. Yeah. The other thing that I like what you're saying. So I strongly believe in decision processes being the test of the quality of the decision rather than the outcome. So, did you collect sufficient information around Russia? Did you collect sufficient information on Ukraine? Did you collect sufficient information around Europe and its role and the U.S. and its role to come up with the bet of an outcome?
Yes.
And I always try to think, what is the quality of the decision process that I'm moving an organization through or a team through? I cannot guarantee an outcome.
Mhm.
I can certainly place a bet. I can think of what's more likely. But more importantly is, who am I listening to? What information are we gathering? How are we collecting that information? How is it informing the next step in the decision process? Um, as we know, the world is so unpredictable, so the outcomes are much harder to know. And so you place this bet, Russia's going to run over it, and here we are. The
Yes.
conflict's still ongoing. So it's tough to predict. And so you go back judging the quality of the decision process, right?
Absolutely. Relatedly, there's one other tip they offer that's exactly in line with what you're saying. Look, I love process. Process is fantastic, especially when you can have like an inclusive, transparent process. There is nothing better. What I find sometimes is it's really easy to keep going through the process, and you can almost use kind of information gathering as a way to paralyze your decision making. And so one tip that they offer is they say, all right, what piece of information changes your mind? What do you need to know that makes you rethink this situation? And I sort of love that idea, because it puts a little bit of an order to how one is taking in a lot of information. So like one thing I worked on a couple of years ago in the Biden administration was the National Defense Strategy. And the National Defense Strategy is effectively a way to say, okay, you've got the Department of Defense of about 3.5 million people, about $850 billion. What are you worried about today and in the future so that you can make sure your strategy matches your budget? And knowing that some of this is predictable, and as you say, like a whole bunch of it is not. And I found in running this massive process on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, it was so important to have an inclusive and transparent process. I was heartened that there was a lot more agreement than disagreement on kind of what the big threats were and how to deal with them. But fundamentally, it was important to figure out, okay, how do we actually get this done in a timely manner and build in feedback loops for when we maybe don't call things correctly?
And what was the key piece of information that you needed? You were talking about, that. What is it that you really need? In this case,
yes. Well, so at least for that one, the National Defense Strategy, which folks can Google, it's unclassified, available online. It's like a homework assignment the Department of Defense has to deliver to Congress every 4 years. And effectively, that one said, look, turbulent world, chaotic world, but the number one challenge for the U.S. is to focus on the role played by China. And the argument was there's no other country with the will and increasingly the capabilities to fundamentally upend the global security order. And so the information that I wanted to gather during that was things like, all right, so, how willing is Beijing to try to change their approach to try to change Indo-Pacific security or global security? What are their current military capabilities? What trajectory are they on? And I'd say the information that would have changed my mind in particular would have been focused on the behavior of the Chinese military, because what I had seen is really for about a decade or so, a whole lot of actions by China's military to really kind of rethink the approach that had worked for 70 plus years or so to Indo-Pacific security and stability. A lot of efforts to destabilize the East China Sea, South China Sea, etc., and to sort of poke and prod and even threaten a bunch of folks around Asia. So I was looking at behavior, and if I was going to start to see behavior where they wanted to work more collaboratively with folks around the region, then that would have called into question if this like number one priority made sense. And spoiler alert, haven't seen that.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. Thank you so much. We're at time. I always love it if the guest, you, Dr. Karlin, would leave our listeners with that one key piece of advice. And you can speak to a college student, or you could a mid-level career person, or someone like me who's, approaching graying quickly and sunsetting in the next decade. What would you say?
Oh, gosh. I would probably say be ready for serendipity. You can make these plans, you can have these ideas, but serendipity, right? Fortunate discoveries are going to just come out of nowhere. be ready for that and willing to jump at those opportunities. And then if I can add one bonus one, I would also probably say focus more on the questions than the answers. It can be so easy, whether you're juggling, issues in your personal life or in your professional life or what have you, to say like, all right, I need to do X, Y, Z. I need to take these steps. And oftentimes actually sitting on the question for a bit and refining the question can be so much more illuminating than running right to the prescription.
Love it. Perfect set of advice. No matter where you are in life and career, take advantage of serendipity, pay attention to the question. Mara, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Scott. It was a real treat.
Yeah, and I'll see you soon.
I'm excited.
All right. This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program where students visit 10 countries on 3 continents, all while taking 3 to 4 college classes through Colorado State University. See course offerings and upcoming voyage itineraries at www.semesteratsea.org. Thank you for joining this week's episode of the As Unexpected podcast. The viewpoints and opinions of featured guests do not necessarily represent those of the Institute for Shipboard Education or Semester at Sea. Hit the like button, share it with your colleagues, family, and friends, and remember, be curious, be compassionate, be courageous. That's what it takes to lead as unexpected.